Welcome to All the Dirt on Winter Sowing. We're going to take you on a guided 10-step tour of winter sowing, and we're going to show you why it's the easiest method of gardening you'll ever love. I'm Molly Moore, and I'm here with Marlene Smith. We are both Charles County, Maryland Master Gardeners. Master Gardeners are volunteers trained and supported by the University of Maryland Extension. Our mission is to educate the public about safe, effective, and sustainable horticultural practices. We're part of the University of Maryland's College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. So what is winter sowing? The USDA definition of winter sowing is a propagation method used throughout the winter where temperate climate seeds are sown into vented containers and placed outdoors to foster naturally timed, high percentage germination of climate-tolerant seedlings. Wow, that's a mouthful. To simplify, winter sowing is an incredibly easy way to grow seedlings. In the middle of winter, you plant seeds in a container with a hole in the top, holes in the bottom for drainage, and wait for them to sprout. The concept of winter sowing was introduced in 2000 by a woman named Trudy Davidoff on gardenweb.com. Since then, winter sowing has become wildly popular as more and more people have discovered this fabulous way to grow plants. So why winter sow? And why has it become so popular? Well, number one reason is it's easy. You don't need any special skills. Even children can winter sow. It doesn't take up space inside your house for special equipment. No grow lights, racks, warming pads, and all that other stuff. It's mostly hands-off once the seeds are planted. Sow and forget, almost, but we'll get to that. Winter sowing is fun. It lets you garden and get your hands dirty during winter when the rest of your garden is sleeping and the days are short and dreary. It's cheap. The whole process is based on recycled containers after all. Milk jugs, plastic fast food boxes, lettuce containers, Ziploc bags, aluminum foil baking pans. If it allows for condensation, you can use it. If you don't drink milk by the gallon, ask your neighbors and friends to save their containers for you. And also, some coffee shops will give you their empty jugs if you ask them. What I love is there are no hard and fast rules. Experiment, use your imagination, see what works for you, just like you do in any other style of gardening. Winter sowing also produces strong, healthy plants. You're going to be amazed the first time you open a container and look at the extraordinary root system below the surface. That's the sign of a really healthy plant. There's no damping off or leggy seedlings because they're planted and grown outdoors. One of the best parts of winter sowing is that you can grow so many unusual veggies and flowers and way more varieties of native plants than you can find in your local nursery or big box store. Need a few more reasons? Winter sowing also provides great benefits for planting, growing, and transplanting your seeds and seedlings. Planting the seeds in containers rather than directly in the ground protects them from being washed away, drying out, or being eaten by critters. It also eliminates competition from other weeds and other plants. We've all planted seeds in our beds, then been unable to tell those tiny flower seedlings from the weeds growing in the same bed. Many native plants and some non-native perennials require cold stratification to germinate. Winter sowing provides natural stratification because the plants are growing outside and will germinate when nature tells them to. In fact, if you run out of jugs, you can just plant most native seeds that need cold stratification in open pots, like all those little plastic nursery pots you've been collecting. Just make sure you have some kind of screen like hardware cloth or small wire over them to keep out the birds and animals. It's not technically winter sowing, but it's a distant cousin, and it works great. Also, no more bags of moldy seeds in the back of your fridge. By the same token, winter sowing eliminates the need for hardening off seedlings, again, because they've been grown outdoors and they're already acclimated. The seedlings are ready to plant whenever the outside temperature has warmed up enough. No more lugging dozens of pots of seedlings from inside your house to the garden in the springtime. You don't need to worry about watering much. The condensation inside those plastic containers is keeping the little seedlings nice and moist. However, you do need to check up on your babies periodically, especially if we're having a really dry winter or if we have a hot and dry early spring. If you notice the mixture really drying out, just spray a little water into the containers. Don't get them waterlogged, just enough to get that condensation going again. So what can you winter sow? Almost anything except tropical plants. Winter sowing was practically made for native plants and perennials, like this little spotted bee balm here. Herbs do stunningly well, as do annuals, and it's great for almost any veggie you want to plant in your garden. You're only limited by your imagination and maybe your space for jugs and containers. When do you start sowing in wintertime? Because winter covers a pretty long time. And different seeds do better if they're planted at different times during the winter. Any plant that needs cold stratification should be planted in the heart of winter, December, January, February at the latest. They need those really cold winter temperatures to germinate. This includes most natives and some non-native perennials. These seeds have a hard coating that helps prevent the seeds from being tricked into coming out of dormancy too early because of unseasonably warm spells in winter, which unfortunately we're having more and more of. But for those warm weather-loving plants, you can sow them much later. The beauty of winter sowing is there are really very few rules. However, March and April are really the best time for you to sow your tender annuals like zinnias and marigolds, vegetables like broccoli and lettuce, herbs like basil and cilantro. And then generally, you wait until April to do those real heat-loving plants like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and pumpkins. But Marlene sowed her tomatoes in March and got a nice head start. When you do that, just beware not to transplant your heat lovers into the garden before the danger of frost is past. Now you know what to plant and when to plant. So here are the tools and equipment you'll need. It's a pretty simple list, and there's plenty of room for imagination and substitution. Remember, winter sowing is about recycling and making use of what you have around the house. We've already talked about the huge variety of containers you can use. The next important material you need is potting mix. And a note of caution here, don't use soil from your garden or compost or leaf grow. It's too compacted and doesn't foster germination. You'll need tape, like duct tape or painter's tape for labeling and for sealing those containers. You'll need a marker for labeling, and a marker that can stand up to the winter rain and snow and the sun's UV rays. Also important, something sharp. Scissors, a sharp knife, a box cutter for slicing through the plastic without slicing through your fingers. I use an X-Acto knife to puncture the jugs and get the cuts started. Here are a few more things that might be handy to have. A bucket or container for mixing up your potting material and your water. Sometimes that's easier than doing it in individual jugs. You also might want plant tags for the inside of the jug if you're worried about your marker on the outside fading or disappearing over the winter. If you have problems with slugs and your containers are on the ground, consider putting old newspaper or coffee filters in the bottom before you put your potting mix in the container. So there's a drill on this list, but not to worry. Marlene is going to let you in on all the secrets of winter sowing as she takes us through 10 very easy steps from prepping your containers to transplanting your babies in the spring. Lead on, Marlene.
Thanks, Molly, for teaching us about the what, why, who, and when of winter sowing. Now let's go over the how. We've broken this method into 10 simple steps that can be taught in less than 5 minutes. But I'll spend a bit of time on each step to give you some information based on our experiences. The graphic on this slide is courtesy of Skycrest Studios and will be provided on our website and social media, along with this video and additional material. Your first step is to collect and wash containers. Molly pointed out that you can use a variety of containers. Simply use what you have on hand. From my experience, I suggest you avoid containers that are stiff and rigid or ones that have ridges. For me, they were not very easy to transplant from. Be sure to wash and rinse your containers to remove any milk or food residue. When selecting your containers, remember that native plants and perennials need a minimum of 4 inches of potting mix to allow strong root development. And as Molly said, use your imagination. If it can hold potting mix and be covered to provide a protective, vented environment, go for it. Now, using a knife, scissors, drill, or hot glue gun, make 4 to 6 holes in the bottom of the container. Or as Molly suggests, another easy way to make holes is using a heat gun that she pilfered from a kid's wood burning set. I enlisted my husband to drill holes in the bottom of the milk jugs while I cut them in half, which saved time on jug prep. Depending on the type of container you're using, there are additional steps to container prep. For jugs and bottles, cut them in half, leaving a 4-inch bottom and a hinge under the handle, as shown in the bottom of this photo. Discard the cap. For containers with flat lids, as the one in the upper left-hand corner, cut several holes in the top. If the container is opaque, like the butter tub in the upper right, cut the inside of the top out, leaving a large enough rim to reseal. After sewing, cover the container with plastic wrap, replace the lid, then poke holes in the plastic wrap to allow air to circulate and the winter elements to get in. Remember, whatever type of container you're using, it's important to let the sun, snow, and rain into your containers, as well as provide air circulation. Preparing labels is one of the most important steps, so you'll notice we mention it several times. Some folks will label the bottom with duct tape and waterproof markers in the top photo, but if you have a lot of jugs, labeling on just the bottom can get frustrating if you have to lift every jug to see what's inside. Others use UV-resistant markers, China markers, grease pencils, etc. on the outside of the jug. And as a backup, in case the labeling on the outside comes off or fades, a popsicle stick or plant marker inside the jug is a good idea. And if you're like me and don't want to spend the time writing all the plant names on containers, you can simply number the containers and keep track of the numbers using a spreadsheet. As Molly pointed out, there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to winter sowing. Just do what works for you. With your container prepped and labels ready, it's time to add potting mix. The first bullet you see is optional. Some winter sowers, like myself, add a water permeable barrier such as a coffee filter, landscape fabric, or newspaper to the bottom of the container before adding the potting mix. As Molly explained, it keeps the contents in and the slugs out. I take this extra step because I have lots of slugs in and around the areas where I plant my containers. I don't want to lose my new seedlings to slugs. Add approximately 3 to 4 inches of potting mix to the container. Tap the container lightly to settle the potting mix and remove air pockets. Then water the potting mix thoroughly until water drains through the bottom. Some of the most frequently asked questions include ones about what type of potting mix to use. Remember, your seeds don't care. They'll sprout in the crack of a sidewalk, so they'll also sprout in potting mix or soilless mixes. I used a dry compressed bale of soilless mix that contained peat moss, perlite, lime, wetting agent, and starter fertilizer that I obtained at a local Amish garden supply store. Some potting mixes may contain mild fertilizers that do not burn seedling roots. It eliminates the step of feeding seedlings if they have to wait their turn to be transplanted into the garden in spring. Using a brand with a slow-release fertilizer is a personal choice. I would caution you to avoid potting mixes that say they are weed-free because these mixes contain chemicals to prevent weed seeds from germinating in the bag. These chemicals will also prevent germination of your precious seeds. And for our damp winter climate in southern Maryland, you may want to avoid using soils with moisture retention crystals because too much moisture causes rot and fosters mildew and fungus. Molly uses a large container such as a wheelbarrow or cement mixing tray to combine 4 parts of potting mix with 1 part vermiculite. She then adds water until the mixture is thoroughly wet but not soggy before scooping it into individual containers. This provides better moisture control and consistency. It's now time to plant your seeds. We recommend you plant only one type of seed per container. But if you do put more than one type of seed in a container, choose seeds that will germinate at the same time and that grow at the same rate. And if you haven't already done so, mark your containers. We can't stress this enough. For ease of handling tiny seeds, you can mix them with coarse sand or vermiculite to help separate them, and then sprinkle on top of the potting mix. For larger seeds, follow the instructions on the seed packet for depth. Molly previously talked about what to sow and when. One thing I'd like to point out here is when you are ready to plant your seeds, ignore the directions on the seed packets, except for the planting depth and the sun requirements for germination. When to plant on a seed packet is for direct sowing outside or for indoor seed starting. If you are not sure how early you should winter sow seeds that need cold moist stratification, you can check various websites. Just remember to winter sow these seeds early enough to allow for the needed cold moist stratification, which ranges from 30 to 90 days, depending on the seed. Here you'll see two different methods of planting. For larger seeds, or those that you know you will transplant individually, you may want to space them apart, as in the photo on the left. For small seeds, or for those that you can and will plant en masse, you can simply sprinkle them over the soil, as you see in the photo on the right. Whichever way you choose to sow your seeds, once they're sown, remember to cover them with potting mix to the recommended planting depth, or simply press them into the potting mix to make good contact if they require light for germination. Either way, follow up with a sprinkle of water to ensure your seeds and top surface are nice and wet. Now it's time to seal the containers with your choice of tape. Another common question is what type of tape should be used. As Molly pointed out, you can use whatever you have on hand. I didn't have duct tape, so I tried clear packing tape and painter's tape. Both worked well, with the painter's tape being much easier for me to remove when the time came to open the containers. Some winter sowers do not use tape at all, but use alternate methods to keep their containers closed. You've planted and closed your containers. What's next? Do not put the caps on the jugs. If you haven't done so already, repurpose the cap for another project or toss it into the recycling bin. Place the containers in a protected area, outside, safe from wind, pets, wild animals, young children, and clumsy spouses. Place them in part shade to part sun, where they'll be exposed to the rain and snow of the winter. The sun promotes condensation inside the jug. Lack of condensation can be a signal that the soil has become dry and it's time to water. And always monitor your containers and remember to keep them wet but not waterlogged. You can water through the mouth of the jug with a spray bottle or by bottom watering. If your soil is too wet and algae grows, you can open your containers to allow them to dry out a bit, then reseal them. My seeds have germinated. Now what? You should open your containers during the day after a true set of leaves appears and the temperatures begin to rise. If there is an unexpected warm spell predicted after your seeds germinate, open your containers and move them to the shade. Direct sun or heat can harm your tiny seedlings. But what if there's an unexpected cold spell predicted after your seeds germinate? Some winter sowers recommend you cover the containers if temps are predicted to go below freezing. You can do this with a sheet, blanket, or row cover. I put my containers beside a south-facing wall and didn't find it necessary to cover any of my containers once they had germinated. Remember, trust the process. Mother Nature knows when to awaken the different seed varieties after they have been exposed to the winter elements for the right amount of time. Don't be alarmed if you open a container and there's a surprise inside. Look closely at this photo. Molly found this little frog inside one of her containers, snuggled into the potting mix where you see the depression near the upper right-hand corner. It came out to greet her when she lifted the lid. The weather is warmed and it's time to transplant your seedlings. Some seasoned winter sowers will transplant their seedlings into the ground as soon as they sprout. Others once they have a set of true leaves, and others will wait until they are an inch or more tall. Again, personal preference and experience. When you decide the time is right for you to transplant, Open the containers, if you haven't done so, to allow them to acclimate for 2 to 3 days. If transplanting individual plants, pull the seedlings apart gently. Some folks recommend using a fork or spoon to help separate the roots if necessary. Although one of the benefits of winter sowing is a stronger root system than when plants are started indoors, the roots can still be fragile. If planting using the hunk of seeds method, use a sharp knife to cut the mass apart brownie style and plant the sections rather than planting individual plants. The thought here is that Mother Nature knows best once again, and the strongest, healthiest plants will survive in these mass plantings. Like any other transplant, water thoroughly. Tomatoes were by far my favorite winter sown vegetable. When I opened that container in April and smelled the distinct aroma of the tomato plant, I was in heaven and hooked. I felt so accomplished because I had never grown tomatoes from seed before. I was a bit aggressive with my tomato timeline, sowing the seeds on March 3rd and transplanting into the ground on April 12th, well ahead of what my parents had always taught me, which was to wait until after Mother's Day to put tender plants in the ground. By mid-July, the plants were taller than my 6'3" husband and taller than their supports. On July 20th, I harvested the first tomato, but the plants produced for another 3 months until we harvested the remaining green tomatoes in late October. Winter sowing allowed me the opportunity to experiment with 22 varieties of tomatoes, something I would not have been able to do had I purchased the plants. I had hundreds of tomato plants, enough to not only fill my own garden, but to share with family and friends and neighbors. I was also able to provide over 40 plants to our Grow It Eat It garden at the Southern Maryland Food Bank. Now back to Molly for her story.
Those tomatoes look good enough to pluck right off the page and eat. One of the great rewards of winter sowing is eating and sharing food you have literally grown from scratch. I also love growing plants for wildlife, birds, pollinators, other insects. Sadly, the native plants that you get in local nurseries and big box stores can be really expensive. That's where winter sowing offers some of its biggest payoffs, literally. This is part of my cardinal flower bed from this past summer. It was too big to fit the entire bed in the photo. Local nurseries generally charge about $6.50 for a single lobelia plant. You can rack up a big bill very quickly. I bought 1 packet of lobelia seeds from a reputable native plant mail order nursery for $3. When I transplanted the seedlings into my native bed here that you see in this photo, I stopped counting at 60. To buy all of those plants would have been a budget-busting $390. To our native ruby-throated hummingbird, this buffet looks as tasty as Marlene's amazing tomatoes. It was also a tasty buffet for our local deer family, but fortunately, there were plenty of plants to go around. With the growing popularity of winter sowing, there are many great resources out there to help you. We list some of them here on these 2 pages. Don't worry about copying all this. We'll make it all available to you. And for any of your gardening questions, the University of Maryland Extension has tons of online resources available. On behalf of the Charles County, Maryland Master Gardener Program, thank you so much for your interest in winter sowing. We hope you'll take the dirt we've dished, start collecting containers, and bring a little springtime into your winter.